Welcome back. This is Daybreak, and thanks for staying with us. The hashtag on X is Citizen Daybreak. The SMS code is 22422 at Citizen TV Kenya and at Ayub Abdikadir. Mr. Paras Shah is the managing partner at Bowman's Kenya. Rose Kananu is infrastructure project specialist, and Mpokolo Makara is the head energy and infrastructure at Standard Bank Group. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for staying with us. Coming to you, Mpokolo, and I'm looking at the procedure of what the PPP Act says, and clearly it says that government or agencies, through agencies, may consider privately initiated proposal, and this it says under section 41 that the contracting authority shall conduct due diligence to confirm the capacity, and amongst the other issues that just listed. The procedure seems to be very clear, but is the manner, in your view, in which this is done from financing perspective adequate to engage the public and provide clarity where it's required for public consumption?
Mm-hmm. And I think the manner of public participation is very clear in terms of where state assets are concerned. But probably the difference for PPPs is that when you look at projects, typically what, as mentioned earlier by Paras, I mean, you have a competitive process, and that would be a form of public participation when you look at PPP specifically. Now, I guess the beauty of PPPs, and as far as I see it at least, is that you often have the contracting authority, as you've said, the PPP directorate, as you've said, / the National Treasury, because it is a sub-division of the National Treasury. You then have a technical team, both from the contractor side and from the financier side. Yeah. You then have a legal team. You then have auditing teams in terms of ensuring that the costing makes sense and that all the parties entering into this particular agreement are comfortable that there is value for money. There have been benchmarks used to say, if I'm building a road of, let's say, 100 kilometers, right? If I compare that road to other similar roads which have been done in Kenya, is the cost comparative? Yeah. If I look at it internationally, it's a cost comparative. But what's very critical to understand is that in making that comparison is what is the scope that you're looking at? What is the design that you're looking at? What is the quality of inputs and products that you're looking at? Because you can't compare a concrete road to a bitumen road. Okay. It's two different materials. But what's important is that your standards are clear, and across all the parties involved, we're all clear as to what the project is, what the costing is, and what the scope is, for us to then come around and say, as a financing party, as a legal party, as a technical party, we are comfortable that we can proceed with this project. Now, I guess that's also a form of sense checking from a due diligence process. But in addition to that process, once that scoping has been done and the private party that's submitting the proposal to government puts a proposal in front of the PPP directorate, there is an option for public participation, as the law states. Now, whether that option is taken up or not, it's a prerogative of the directorate to take.
Yeah, because also the Directorate of the Public-Private Partnerships is required to establish that the entity is not corrupt, hasn't been engaged in any acts of corruption, that it's tax compliant in all jurisdictions, and the entity and its officers have not been convicted of any criminal conduct within a period of 5 years. Certainly, coming to you, Rose, it appears that the procedure and the laid down law is clear to the extent of what's required, and we require infrastructure expansion. Certainly, we need our airport to expand, get more visitors to come to Kenya. We need an expansion of our road network. We need an expansion of the energy sector. But are you concerned that this very same procedure is not adhered to from the government side or from the government's perspective? Because clearly where Kenyans are concerned is how the money will be spent, that will be through the public-private partnerships, and the manner in which this is done, and failure to make public the information.
Yes, that's definitely of concern, that this making the procedure that government has followed to arrive at the Adani proposal has not been made transparent so that people just get that level of comfort. Mpokolo has described the due diligence process and the nature and speciality of the different institutions that are involved in checking on the credibility of the entity that is coming with the proposal, looking at the financial capability, looking at they done similar projects. What we need, because we don't know to what extent the government has done that process, that's what needs to be made clear. What is true is that the airport needs an expansion. That's not in debate. But we need to get that process, just let government come out and show us that they've gone through this due diligence and they're happy that Adani, hasn't been convicted, is a good partner to go with for this long-term project, because it's going to be a development partner with us for the next 30 years. So it's like a marriage, you need to be with the person that is going to, you're very sure you've done due diligence and you're clear that this person is a good party to go with. So that's, I think, the process that's not been made transparent. Yeah. Whether given that we have all these institutions that have been looking at this Adani project, the contracting authority themselves, all these institutions that are set up around the PPP committee, let us see what they've been doing so that we have that level of comfort that due process is being followed and we're going to bed with a good partner to develop our project. Yeah.
Mr. Shah, let's then talk about the financial health of the process itself. For example, this morning the papers are reporting, as I have earlier mentioned, the Kenya Railways has defaulted on 167.5 billion. This is just part of the SGR which was constructed during President Kenyatta's administration. And what then is the requirement on the part of how then the money will be recouped and generally the financial health of the projects which are undertaken?
The law is very clear on the feasibility, the financial, the legal, the social, the environmental, technical, etc., that the government needs to assess when looking at any of these projects. Pokolo had mentioned earlier that the government or the procuring entity must make sure that if we are doing this project for 20 years or 30 years, that we have the ability to make sure that the financial obligations that come with that, whether it is to the lenders or to the contracting party or whatever, are planned for. Now, I don't know where that deficit has come from. Is it because Kenya Railways used the railway development levy for something else or whatever? I don't know. We don't know the full facts there. The reality is when the SGR was done, a feasibility should have been done. And there was something that certainly no Kenyan really knows how the SGR was really built or financed. But it was done. Now, did they go through that process? I don't know. Should they have done it? Absolutely yes. I'll give you another example, the expressway. I think it is a great project. I think it has transformed the lives of people in Kenya, particularly in our city, and it has really helped. However, is the financial viability of it, is it viable financially? I hope so, but I don't know. So far, it looks fine. From the tolls that we're paying, it might be paying for itself. So going back to the points that have been made by the panel, if there was transparency around this is the cost of it, this is how we're going to pay for it, this is the plan to earmark the money from public funds or from consumer funds to pay for it, then absolutely it should work. So to answer your question, the law provides for it. Do the government or the procuring entities do the proper assessments? I'm not really sure, but should they? Yes. There's something very interesting that you must have read in the press in the last 2 or 3 days. The IMF has said we're now willing to help build capacity. And actually that's a very important point, that we do have these institutions on paper, the PPP unit, the Treasury is there to look after it, parliamentary committees. Do they really have the capacity to look at these projects? We have been on the other side as private sector against government in many projects. And sometimes you wonder whether the people that you're dealing with actually understand the complexity of a project. And what the government should be really focusing on is actually taking that help and saying, let's build the capacity. The Act clearly says that there should be standardized project agreements. Do we have them so many years later? No. Does it cost much to put them together? No. So why hasn't all that been done? So let's build the capacity of these institutions. Because if we have robust institutions with capacity, all these things would be taken care of.
And you have brought up a very pertinent point before I come to Mpokolo, which is on the standard gauge railway. And ideally, the contractual obligation has been what is of concern to the public. And here is what the law points out, as we mentioned earlier here, of openness, accountability, and Kenyans to be involved through public participation, all matters that involves the financial management of their country. For example, the standard gauge railway and the expressway remain unknown to the taxpayer in terms of the obligation. And the public audit by the parliamentary records shows that the Kenya Ports Authority assets were put at risk in relation to the contract, yet the port was not the owner or the implementer of the project here. I mean, it raises a lot of concern, is it, as to how we are undertaking this in a rather questionable fashion, when, as we have mentioned, clearly the law provides for what needs to be done, the feasibility study, the due diligence that should be undertaken, public-private partnerships. To the extent President Kenyatta, on the 28th of December 2018, said he will make public the SGR contract. He never did. He left office. And it seems we are still groping in the dark and about the unknown, is it? So what does the government need to do to win public confidence back?
The government needs to go on a massive drive to show transparency. If the Kenyatta government didn't show the contract, surely this government can show it. And many other things. So number one, it needs to be very transparent. Why we have opacity in all these things, I don't really know. But if the Adani project, and I don't know whether it's good or not, by the way, I'm not here to comment on that, but if it is indeed good for the country, then let that be known. Let the terms of that contract be known. I have seen on social media the initial submission from Adani. It looks actually wonderful if it is implemented in the way they say it will be. Does it have all the contractual terms? Not yet. But let's also be a little bit sympathetic to the executive. Because sadly in Kenya, anything that the government does, not just now, but historically, we suspect. We think it shouldn't be done. So we go to the courts, we stop it. And we've stopped a lot of development because of that. And sometimes you wonder, like in this particular JKI story, the stage that it is at, from what I've read, it's not even at that project agreement stage where negotiations happen, where the terms are discussed, etc. It's very much at the first submission stage. So maybe those terms are not even agreed yet. And the government just needs to come out and say that. And when they are going to agree it, be transparent to the Kenyans and say, this is what it is. This is why it's good for the country. This is how we're going to finance it. These are the benefits, etc., etc. But we've got to, we were saying earlier, we've got to sometimes think and allow the executive to also do its job, which is where you do have some sympathy for the government.
Okay, all right. Mpokolo, coming to you. The reason as to why Kenyans are suspicious to an extent about their government is looking back at the Auditor General's report to just highlight this because it's very key, and this was an audit done between the financial years 2019-20, 21-22, and sampled all loans, including those of the public-private partnerships, and pointed out that most of these were procured without companies. With other options, loans were approved without proper planning and preparedness, no public participation. Ministries were approached directly by the financiers. Financiers established the target projects. In some cases, the financiers funded the feasibility studies itself. So the Kenyan people have, to some extent, the right to doubt what's being undertaken. And in a nutshell, that also highlights an emboldened citizenry who is aware of what's happening in their country. Mpokolo, coming to you. From financing perspective, then here, what's the level of the recouping here of these projects once they are undertaken? Surely it needs proper management, is it? And from your understanding, from your studies as the head of energy and infrastructure at the Standard Bank Group, what has been your observation of how these projects have fared on once they are done?
Mm-hmm. And I think it varies, really, across different geographies. It really varies. What we saw in Kenya, as an example, I mean, the energy sector in Kenya is highly developed in the sense that when the first IPPs were implemented, it was because there was an energy crisis in the country. Now, when you're procuring a project or a good in crisis mode, it's an emergency. You don't have the time to go through a public participation process, and it's about what is the quickest, fastest way I need to get to this, right? It's going to be expensive. Supply demand, just as the laws of supply demand. If, however, as has been said earlier on the panel, a thorough process is followed in terms of time, understanding, working to the long-term plan of the country, which I understand is Vision 2030, then there should be a sequencing of how do we work at achieving the key objectives of the long-term development of the country driven by Vision 2030. But you'll always work backwards, right? When it was first developed, there was a long time to go and a lot to do. We're now sitting in 2024. So typically, most infrastructure projects, energy can take you at least 18 months to construct. Road projects, depending on the size and scope, can take you anything from a year to 3 years. Now, when I say you work backwards with thinking, how long will it take me to construct? At the back end of that is how long will it take me to procure? How long will it take me to do the feasibility, the legal assessment, the technical assessment, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So all of those variables really come down to the cost of preparation and then the cost of actually implementing a project. Now, how we evaluate it from a commercial bank perspective, typically when we look at financing a PPP, where debt typically is between anything from 50 to 80% of the total project cost, is to say, one, what is the interest rate? We will, I guess, charge the project, whatever the prevailing interest rate is. It's transparent, it's in the market, it's very clear. There are benchmarks, there are CBK rates, it's no longer LIBOR, but there are international benchmarks which are transparent and can be seen. We'll add a debt margin onto that, whether you're financing a project for 5, 7, 20, or 15 years, the applicable margin. Now, that's on the debt component of it. But remember, from a project perspective, the investor who's putting in the balance of what we're not putting in. So let's say we've put in 80% of the debt, of 80% of the project is debt, the 20% the investor must put in equity. They, of course, want a return, right? The difference in the two financing mechanisms being that debt, as I've said, you've got a fixed margin, you know what you're getting, there is no upside. Equity, on the other side, you're hoping to make a return once you've covered all your fixed costs. Your fixed costs being your operations and maintenance costs, your salaries and expenses, your tax expenses, and your debt costs, right? Now, only after those have been covered will you as equity make a return. So that's typically measured in IRR. So typically what we would do is then look at what is the average IRR of the project over the project life and the debt term to give us a sense of what the right benchmark is. And that's typically because we work a lot with the private party looking to participate in PPPs. So that's our benchmark really that we would use. I mean, that number varies depending on country and state of development from, let's say, early double digits to high teens. Now, we then evaluate to say, okay, fine, is this IRR expensive? If I look at a similar project which has been done in Kenya as a jurisdiction, is it a new project? There's higher risk and higher execution risk, so that number should be higher. Has it been done? Are we comfortable that you can procure the goods locally? Do you need to import them? So it's things like that, like supply chains begin to matter. So it's not a simple answer. A lot of variables go into saying what is the right mix to get to the right returns and therefore the right metric to evaluate this project from a financing perspective. Hence why I said it's so important that all parties across the table, technical, legal, equipment suppliers, are around the table to understand that we're all getting a fair deal, but we all understand what the process to implement that project is from day one until it's completed. Yeah, and annually or in terms of coming in as a player, what number of projects do you then finance, for example, in this case? Because Mr. Shah mentioned in his opening remarks that Kenya and Africa, by extension, because of capacity and other challenges, PPP is the way to go. But certainly then, as a key player in this setup and in this equation, in a month, in a year, what's the number of projects you finance or help financing? So from remember as a commercial bank, our client base is made up of the public sector and the private sector. The private sector, we probably do typically in energy and infrastructure anything from, I will look at our activity this year, let's say 3 transactions a year. But let's not make the mistake of understanding the complexity of a corporate loan relative to a project finance structure. Two are very different. If I then look at PPPs, I have been in this country for 2.5 years now. I have not done one new transaction with PPP, purely because of this conversation we're having here, and just the process it's taken and the level of development of PPPs in this market specifically. If I speak to some of our clients in the energy sector, they'll tell you that it takes them a good 10 years to develop a project. It shouldn't, but it's a function of market readiness, access. We've had a PPA moratorium in this country, hence why it takes that long, right? So it's those many factors which then influence how long it takes to do a project. But simplicity to tell you, from a PPP perspective, a project finance perspective, we haven't done one in Kenya a new one in the last 2.5 years.
What could be the challenge?
Exactly the conversation that we're having here.
To put it to you, corruption?
I'm not saying that. I'm saying I think the regulations are there, but investors also don't want to invest their money in an uncertain environment where it could be challenged. It's people's time and money. There's an opportunity cost. I have an investor, for example, when we started talking maybe 18 months ago, they were ready. They've got existing assets. For confidentiality, of course, I can't be specific, but their investment thesis of coming into Kenya was to say, we'll invest in the power sector because Kenya is looking forward to be a green economy, right? We will then, over time, convert our equipment to be environmentally friendly, right? That hasn't happened because why? PPA moratorium has been in existence. They can't do anything. They can't expand their capacity. What they've done, they've gone to Asia to invest. So what I'm saying is it's really about market readiness.
Okay.
And the opportunity costs investors take in terms of the time it takes to do projects and the little time it would take to do projects and start earning money in other jurisdictions.
All right, Mr. Shah, I'll come to you because these challenges is what we need to expound on further. Because in 2019, the Israeli ambassador to Kenya had requested his government in Tel Aviv to call him back and requested the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to call him back because he felt frustrated by the players in the government of kickbacks because of the company, which was an Israeli undertaking, the Galana Kulalu food project, which was meant to address the food security challenges. And he had to tell his government to call him back because he was unable to move simply because of frustrations and bottlenecks and bureaucracies along the way. Rose, given what the PPP Act outlines, and this includes guidance on the principles of accountability, cost effectiveness, and equal opportunity. Is this proving to be a challenge given the discussion that's ongoing in the country at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, we're seeming to not make a lot of progress in the PPP space, in my view, because of insufficient capacity, insufficient knowledge. PPPs have been around for a long time. We started to put up an act in place way back, the policy 2010, the first act 2013, repealed in 2021. We now, with I think the constitutional case that has just been put through by Katiba, we could have another review. So we're not making progress in terms of utilizing this very robust PPP framework that has been put in place for us to start progressing and develop projects through the framework that has been put in place for us to start progressing and develop projects through the PPP framework. Now, PPP is not a silver bullet. It's not the answer to everything. Not all projects are suited for the PPP process, and therefore we need to just be prudent on what is it that can go through the PPP framework and what can go through other framework. But we are not progressing because they are complex projects, as has been said. We have capacity issues, and I'm glad to hear IMF now is stepping in. World Bank has supported us a long time in terms of even just putting together that framework over those number of years that we've put it in place. Unless we create a favorable PPP market, we are not going to attract private parties to want to come and support government in development of these projects. We need to create that environment that gives the confidence even to the private sector and the public, so that we reduce this every time government wants to put up a project, even before people know what it is about, they simply rush to court and say, since it's government, I don't trust them, so stop the process. We're not going to move. We have a big infrastructure deficit. We have a fiscal capacity issue, and PPP can help solve that problem because it is going to mobilize private financing and bring in that extra capacity that we need. Certainly, we should not be taking 10 years to develop projects. Yeah. I mean, an investor is not going to want to have their money sitting in this level of uncertainty. So if we improve the capacity situation, make that transparency so that the public is supportive and open to government using the instruments that are available to it to be able to develop our projects, then I believe some of these issues we're seeing will start to get better, and we'll have more projects being developed. Yeah,
and Mr. Shah, given the 10-year period that Mpokolo talked about and some of the other challenges, Ross points out a favorable environment. How does the environment, how does it supposed to be looking like?
From a private sector point of view,
yeah.
Even us who work in the private sector in Kenya, or from a foreign investor's point of view, you need a few basic things. Number one, predictability. You need to understand and be sure that if you've come to invest, within 18 months or 24 months or whatever your time frame is to implement a project, it will be done. We don't unfortunately have that. So number one, we need to make sure that if we say we're going to do something, it is done. Number two, I won't talk a lot more about this,
yeah.
but people don't like corruption. We don't like corruption. Nobody likes corruption. So that needs to be addressed. And that needs to be addressed in multiple manners. You talked about parliamentarian.
Yeah.
One of the roles of parliament is to appoint or vet people. Look at the headline in The Nation today.
Yeah.
These are people that parliament should be looking at. Why do we complain about an institution, the very people of which you have approved? And then you complain about how they're working. So let's look at the role of parliament. Let's look at, you should call the judiciary people here, ask them why they're letting people off the hook when there's clear evidence of corruption. Let's talk to the DPP and their unit, why they're not prosecuting. And there's multiple ways of dealing with this, right? So that's a topic for probably a year's worth of discussion. If you resolve that, I think you resolve everything, not just in Kenya, but probably in many parts of the world. Then you need kind of stability.
Yeah.
You need to have an environment where people know actually that the fiscal stability will be around about this level for the tenure of my project. Yes, things happen, things go up and down, but by and large, you need that kind of stability. You need confidence in your counterparty, the government, the procuring entity, that what they've said they will do, they will behave accordingly. So you need all those factors for it to work. Do we have the laws? We have wonderful laws in this country, absolutely first-class laws, starting with the Constitution and everything that came under it. The problem we have is we have not built up the institutions to implement and to enforce these laws as we should have. 14 years have now gone since 2010. We should have, and I don't see why we don't. And by the way, if you ask anyone for help around the world, there'll be plenty of people to help you to do this. This is not stuff that has not been done in other parts of the world. It has been done. So it is the willingness of the executive, the judiciary, the parliament to behave in a manner where they can create robust institutions for predictability, yeah, for stability, etc.
Yeah. And you were talking about predictability. On Monday last week, the National Treasury Principal Secretary, Dr. Kipto, pointed out what he termed as now that having a tax policy which will create a consistent taxation regime. Has that been a problem in the past, and do you think this now adopted as a policy will address the challenges?
Taxation is a huge problem, and the unpredictability of taxation and the way the KRA behaves in terms of going after taxpayers. The reality is actually in this country, this is another debate altogether, but I'll mention it anyway, there is enough money in this country to finance whatever the government needs to finance. The problem we have is we have a very small proportion of the population that pays tax. That really is the problem. If you expand that tax net, which I'm glad the Cabinet Secretary is focusing on, where people who are not paying tax should pay tax, then we should be collecting enough money. What is happening right now is those of us probably around this table and others who pay tax are being hammered every day. More tax, more tax. And you're killing the goose that lays the golden egg. What you need to do is have many geese. And that's where the taxation problem is started. That's a story for another day. Frankly, if we do it properly, we won't need PPPs. The government will be able to finance everything.
Yeah, and ideally has as many taxpayers as possible within that bracket and get more golden eggs. Mpokolo, what then needs to happen is, I mean, Mr. Shah, all of you pointed out that clearly PPPs are the way because of the lacking financial muscle to undertake massive infrastructure projects. But it can never be a forever thing. At some point, the country must be able to finance its projects. How can that be attained from financial perspective?
Look, it's really just having more geese, because then you can take a market view. Any investor coming into a market takes a market view. I don't think investors are unreasonable or unrealistic in that they only take a view that they're taking a payment risk view on the sovereign or public funds, right? Public funds, to the extent that you have a population that is active, that will have a demand for a particular good or a service, and that demand of a particular good or a service will generate enough revenues, cost reflective, for them to cover their costs and make a little bit of a profit. That's how private sector works. Now, when you start talking excessive profit, that's a different conversation, right? But again, as has been mentioned on this platform, including planning, as Rose has said, is that if you look at a proper planning time frame, you'll be able to reflect where demand drivers are going and reflect what your cost is today to be able to say, okay, I can pay a premium today because I don't have this good or service in the country at this moment, but I am creating capacity through either a PPP or through stimulating this part of the economy. It has been done everywhere. It's how economies are developed. In fact, it's a book I haven't read and I must still read. Somebody shared it with me over the weekend, saying how Asia was built. But simplistically, that because, let's use Japan as an example, because it's an island, they had limited geographic scope. They were very clear that, hence why you've got big Japanese trading companies today. They were very clear that for you to be successful, you can't base your demand on the small island, because then you're not being innovative. We will actually give you incentives for any sales that you make extending to the country, because that means you're meeting international standards, which means you're not comfortable on the fact that you've got a definite demand domestically. You've got to be innovative, give us best in class. The only way to do so is to go outside, get experience externally, bring around the table people who have seen different areas of development in different parts of the world to give best in class, which I would like to think is what PPPs provide Kenya with an opportunity for. But in that doing as well, you also have comparators that you can use which have been done successfully elsewhere to say, is this model in the form of this project and how it's being implemented the correct one for Kenya? Is it sustainable? Is it viable? That's ultimately how these things should be looked at.
And can financial stability to, in future, undertake projects, huge projects like road network and the infrastructure that we are talking about, be attained in the Kenyan context if we focus and the state focuses on productivity-led, export-oriented economy? Because at the moment, more or less, it's a consumption economy. Can we then move to that stage of becoming productivity-led, export-oriented economy now to target the markets beyond Kenya, as you have mentioned in giving the example of Japan?
Absolutely. Nothing is stopping Kenya from doing that if you have a development plan and agenda that is articulated, it's publicized, so investors and even domestic investors understand where the opportunities are, and they're prepared to invest and put funds for that plan to materialize. I think the challenge is because there isn't a articulate and a consistency, investors don't like risk, right? Some investors don't have as much of a deep pocket as others. So of course, 100 million might be small in one investor's mind, whereas in another investor's mind, it could sink them. So, those are the variables that investors take into account when making investments into, let's say, an export-led development agenda. If I look at, for example, the energy sector, and I'll use that because that's probably been the most active and most vibrant, right? We're currently sitting at around 3.2 megawatts in Kenya with a population of around 56 million. Now, if you look at the sales of energy, those are predominantly across, let's say, your domestic sector. For the ambitions of Kenya to get to, let's say, even if it's the 100 gigawatts over the long term to support a green economy, it's going to take some radical thinking, proactiveness, decisiveness, but being very clear about what that path is. There are risks, yes. When those risks do materialize, what are the interventions and how do you leverage players across the table, across the world to help you get there? It's been done elsewhere. I think it's really just about, being transparent and open about what the plan is, being transparent and open about what the interventions are, and taking up the capacity building efforts which have been put on the table from the likes of the World Bank for this to materialize. Yeah. Can Kenya achieve it? Absolutely. But it is not going to happen by believing it. It's going to happen by doing it and being practical and implementing policies and interventions to get to that ultimate end path. Yeah,
and I'll come to you, Rose. Mr. Shah, how much has the high cost of power contributed to a decline in manufacturing? Because ideally, if you look at the taxation regime, clearly, as you have mentioned, it's targeting the marginalized who are paying for the majority in this case, and whose pay slips continue to get thin by the day. But how can then be there a focus on lessening the cost of power, increase manufacturing, create jobs which are decent, get more people in the tax bracket, and then tax more? And is this a reason as to why, in failing to address these challenges and coming up with answers to that problem, why we are seeing capital flight out of the market?
The last bit, absolutely, we are seeing capital flight. I think, is the cost of power a contributing factor? It is one of a contributing factor. There are many others, and I'll come to that. But let's get to the cost of power. Why do we have such a high cost of power? I think there are multiple reasons for that. Number one is probably a creaking infrastructure in terms of our transmission lines, in terms of our power generation, etc., etc. That needs to be dealt with. If we had an efficient transmission system, then the cost of power, the leakage would come down, the cost of power would come down. Put it very simplistically. Pokalo has talked about the moratorium. We have a crisis coming, whether we like it or not. If this moratorium is not lifted now, in 3, 4, 5 years, we're going to have power shortages, the likes of which were seen in South Africa, which crippled their economy. And the government needs to address that very quickly. There are people willing to invest in the power sector. We need to lift this moratorium, let the process run, and have sufficient power. We have green power. It's very efficient power. So the cost of power is one factor. But why is there this problem in the manufacturing sector? There are many reasons. There is a problem of infrastructure. The cost of transporting goods from Mombasa to Nairobi is more expensive than getting them from Dubai to Mombasa. It's crazy, right? And why is that? We need to invest in roads, etc., etc., etc. The cost of getting your goods out from the port in Mombasa or wherever through customs takes a ridiculously long time. It is riddled with corruption. That's a contributing factor. The kind of market level playing field is not there in many sectors. That is a contributing factor. So there are many, many factors why the manufacturing sector is in the problems that it is in. The constant harassment from officials every day. If you ask a manufacturer how many people they have to deal with, these are all costs of doing business, and it becomes a problem. So yes, power is a problem, but I should also say that expensive power is better than no power. If you didn't have power, where we've seen, for example, in South Africa, the cost of that is far more to the economy than expensive power. Whether we should have efficient and cheap power, absolutely yes. But let's be very clear that that is only one factor.
How can we get cheap power then? Because it's a concern for many Kenyans, because you look at the disposable income. Yeah, and it's minutiae. And here, of course, paying for expensive power bills outweighs no power, certainly. But how do you get cheap power? Because there is the natural resources which are available. How do we get there?
Look, I'm no expert in this, but in a way, it's a bit of supply and demand. If you had enough supply of power, or maybe even oversupply, the prices will come down. It's a factor of that. It's how the government negotiates with PPPs to make sure the tariffs are right, in the right currency, at the right cost for the Kenyan consumer. It's investment in, as I said earlier, in the infrastructure, in the power sector, in the transmission lines, in the generation, in the distribution. All of that All of that can be addressed. Just if you I don't know what the real number is, but I'm sure if the leakage of power was reduced by 5%, the cost of power probably come down by a little bit more. From what I understand, the leakage is a massive cost in our grid. So all these things can be addressed to get cheap power. Are we doing enough? Absolutely not.
All right. And Rose, then here comes the Adani deal in the Ketrako affair. Whilst the government has provided justification that this will address the perennial power shortages and outages, intermittent power blackouts, the manner in which this is done is again raising a lot of questions, is it, as was the case with the JKIA matter, which we substantively debated? Yeah.
Let me segue off, the discussion on the cost of power, the need to complete the infrastructure. So first, there's an focus on Adani, but Adani is not the only PPP at Ketrako. We have Africa 50 that has put in PPPs at Ketrako as well. But having said that, generally looking at why we've been struggling with bringing our cost of power down is because Ketrako has not been able to complete many of its power lines. We actually have overgeneration. We have, when you're talking about the supply issue, KenGen has developed sufficient supply of power that we are ready not only to serve Kenya, but also to sell. We're ready to interconnect into the power pools for trading of power. But Ketrako at the moment is constrained financially, because the number of power lines that they need to complete across the country and to interconnect, the Ethiopia-Kenya power line, interconnect to Tanzania, because by interconnecting into the power trading pools, we are actually going to get access to cheaper power because we will be able to have better tariffs. What Ketrako has done, because of the fiscal challenge that they have, there's quite a number of previously done projects that have are sitting with huge pending bills. There's not enough funding to Ketrako as to KPLC and other entities because government has a challenge of finances. PPPs are being seen as a key enabler to Ketrako, and Ketrako needs to be enabled because unless we complete and interconnect our power lines grid, we will not be able to access this surplus power that we have that will bring the cost of power in the country down and start earning us money as a country when we start trading and selling power to Tanzania and selling power to Ethiopia and just interconnecting into those trading pools. So going back to Adani, we need that transparency. But I think there's more to be said about the other PPPs that have been submitted to Ketrako. Let Ketrako come out and clearly demonstrate the process that as a contracting authority they are going through to use the PPP process to unlock. And in fact, I think if there is an entity that is really going to benefit from PPP, it is Ketrako.
And here's the thing, because you mentioned the other...
we have Africa 50, I think, has put in... they have 4 PPPs that are being considered. Adani has...
Adani is 1, Africa 50 is 2.
Yeah. So they're continuing to get other proposals being submitted. Because, if I'm not wrong, we're looking at about 20,000 kilometers of power line that still needs to be completed. Case in point, when we built Lake Turkana wind power, we paid huge fines because Ketrako had not interconnected. So we started paying what is called deemed generated capacity fines because this PPP entity built this massive wind power project and was ready. And once they interconnected Lake Turkana wind power, it's now one of the biggest suppliers into our power supply in the country. And that did bring down the cost just by introducing Lake Turkana wind power into the grid. It significantly had an impact on stability of our power, so the blackouts are not as to come in and help us develop our power sector. certainly we'll see our cost of power come down. We will see our manufacturing improve. Special economic zones, we're talking about export. We will activate the special economic zones so that we can create factories and start exporting. Yeah, so power is a key linchpin to unlocking the economy.
So to get it clear, Africa 50 was part of the the companies meant to undertake the project?
Africa 50 is just another private party that is putting in
just like Adani.
PPP, just like Adani.
But here's the thing, because I brought up that matter, Mr. Shah, Mpokolo and Madam Rose, is because Adani in this regard of our power has received a great degree of support from senior government officials, including the president. So doesn't this then give it undue advantage? Because the process is very clear, as we have talked about the law and the procedure, that it ought to be competitive, where all this is subjected to proper regulatory processes and undertaken by the mandated agency. But when the head of state speaks about this matter, senior government officials, the minister officials speak about this matter, isn't this a blank check to one over the other?
Again, as we say, we don't have the full details. Why is Adani being given more focus and not the other private parties? We don't have an answer to that. Where I stand is the process just needs to be made very transparent. And if there are other parties, and especially in the power sector, I believe they also need to be, given that same prominence, because unlocking power infrastructure in the country. Yeah. It's going to be a
It's certainly key, as Mr. Shah has mentioned, and the requirement for the expansion of our infrastructure, including airports and roads. Mr. Shah, there are 31 projects in the pipeline at various stages, and these are all PPP projects which are meant to be undertaken. We have talked about the procedure and what the law requires. And of course, if well harnessed, this can work to the advantage of economic growth. But do you think that this will happen in your view, given the challenges that we have talked about?
I'm an optimist. I'm a firm believer that if you want things to happen, they can happen. And can they happen quickly? Yes. I think the government needs to step up in its capacity building, in its being transparent, giving the information to the people on all these projects, and get on with it. There is absolutely no reason why most of those projects should not happen, provided they're good for the country. And provided there's transparency.
Yeah, and Mpokolo, talking about the capacity building that we have talked about, how key is the engagement of parties you talked about, like IMF and Bretton Woods institutions and the others, in the coaching and the provision of guidance in this regard for the total adherence to what the law says and the procedures do provide?
I think very key in that, quote unquote, they're gatekeepers. To incentivize providing the flow of funds to some of the development plans that Kenya as a country has, right? Are they the sole protagonists and players who can facilitate that? Absolutely not. Their mandate is to ensure that law and governance is adhered to, in the same way that they're a public institution, given their membership status, that they're able to account for why they chose to provide a funding package to Kenya. So from that perspective, absolutely yes. And the incentive is that any funds that they disperse to Kenya need to be deployed, implemented in the right way and sustainably, which is what their mandate is. They're a development bank to facilitate development. Are there other players in the form of the likes of Power Africa, in the forms of, the consulting for services that Rose herself provides, sitting in Kenya, who's got the local knowledge of how this market works and can work with the likes of international players to say, that is world-class what's being done there, boilerplate, but the nuances from a Kenya perspective are X, Y, and Z. How do we work together to ensure that governance is adhered to make sure that projects are sustainable, they're completed, they're implemented, and they really serve the purpose that they were initially intended for? So are they a gatekeeper? Yes, but the point that I'm making is there are many more. Their mandate is mainly financially driven, but from a technical market relevance, sustainability perspective, there are other players in the value chain who can also provide that service, working with government. Do we proactively do it as a private sector? Absolutely, hence why we're sitting here. our interest collectively is to ensure that infrastructure is developed, and we understand that we have to also take a step back in terms of ordinarily where we would be involved. As a commercial bank myself, I would only get involved once the feasibility is done, once the permitting is done. Yeah. You've got a model that works, it's packaged, and I can progress. But the market is not there. So we all understand that. We all have a role to play in part of developing the sector and being involved very early on in the development of a project. I mean, Rose mentioned Africa 50. As far as I recall, I think that's been at least a 2-year process, because they've been following the process and the journey. And why? By virtue of who they're also owned by, the AFDB and other public funds, they don't want to be seen to be flouting process. So what I'm saying is there are also various players across various aspects of the value chain who can ensure that governance and accountability and provide the technical capacity and assistance to government in very many ways to make sure that PPPs actually progress. And not just PPPs, but the development agenda actually happens. Because there are private players who are prepared to take a market risk and a market view. Okay. But to Paras's point, if we're not clear on what the long-term plan is, it's very difficult for an international investor to take a long-term view on a market that they do not know.
All right. And Rose, then, before we sample the feedback that we have, and possibly if there are questions you can respond to, we traveled this pathway with the SGR, and Kenyans woke up to this with the demands for answers from the government. The contractual obligations, we talked about the settlement in case there are any disputes. We also talked about the financial sustainability of these projects once they are undertaken, and the time taken to recoup. But how then do we stop at the point of making clear these contractual obligations for the Kenyan people to understand, to digest, because in the event, any disputes happen or any matter regarding financial commitments arise, it's the Kenyan people who pay back. So have we learned our lessons from this year?
I do hope we have learned our lessons, and we're in early stages really of developing infrastructure. If you look at Vision 2030, look at even just LAPSET, the number of projects that we need to develop, there's still a long ways to go. SGR was the first big project that inspired a lot of controversy, maybe, and a lot of public participation. The environmentalists were up in arms because the SGR was cutting through a lot of national conservation sites, and and all that. And there's a lot of lessons we have learned when we look at the impact of the loan of the SGR. It was one of the reasons we were saying, we are almost in a debt non-repayment crisis situation because of the SGR. So these lessons, we need to apply them as we go forward, because we need to build more infrastructure. We need to build the airport. There are cities. If you look at the LAPSET program, it has 3 cities. There's a crude oil pipeline. There's a lot of massive projects. Now, we should not be treating the current situation we're in as a crisis situation like we did when we had power issues back in the 90s, and we had to rush and do direct procurement. We're not at that stage. Let us walk slowly with the public. Let them understand the process. Let them understand, yes, there is a need to move fast in developing some of the infrastructure, in building our airport, because it's going to unlock economic activity. Our power lines we've spoken about, and there are many others. In the health sector, there's quite a lot of infrastructure that needs to be built. But let's walk slowly with the public. Let them understand, let them see the transparency, let them build trust, so that we have stability to allow more infrastructure to be built. And let's also be careful that we are not unnecessarily tying the government and the people into contracts that could come to bite us in the future, because, as you say, it's the Kenyan people that are going to pay.
Let's now sample the feedback, ladies and gentlemen. And here's what you're saying on X, formerly Twitter. Our hashtag is Citizen Daybreak. The SMS code is 22422 at Citizen TV Kenya and at Ayub Abdikadir. Sir Nixon Dugura says, when a public-private partnership succeeds, everyone is a winner. the public entity, the private enterprise, and the citizen at large. However, the process to such success must be ethical. General Lazaro says public concerns is legitimate. Any deal touching public properties without proper consultations through public participation forum is amounts to economic crime. MC_Rumor says, if you look at Adani Group deals, it shows that the mafia have a country. The single sourcing of Adani shows that the JKI and Katrako deals are meant to siphon public money by the political elite, not transparency. Babu Michael says, PPPs aren't bad deals, but few important things must be clear about them. Openness, public involvement, public participation, value for money, must follow the right procedures, etc. This will strengthen public trust in them generally. I am Kakedu says PPPs are good if due processes are followed. The problem Kenya Kwanza administration is handling some means 6 outside. Everything, maybe he meant the stipulated laws. There should be good intentions on these PPPs deals. Okelo Mwalimu says, over the years, successive regimes have taken wananchi for a ride by entering into shady deals. Most of such deals have birthed many white elephants. In this case, it means project resulting in loss of our finances. It has reached a point where the landlord has to take full ownership. The final comments, Mr. Shah, 30 seconds.
You know, we have huge potential in this country. If you remember the great Kibaki days, and I do because I did a lot of work with the government at that time, that first government implemented lots of projects. Think of a superhighway, internet, lots of different things. And we're seeing the benefits of that. I just urge this government to do what, I think it was Babu there, who said, follow the law, be transparent, and get these projects done, and gain the trust of the people. And if they do that, and I think they have the intention to do it, let them get it done, and hopefully we will see prosperity.
Yes, okay. Mpokolo.
I think Kenya has great potential. It is a key market in the region. For us as an organization, Stanbic Bank, Standard Bank, it is a growth vector across the group. So I think that signifies the potential we see in the country. Having said that, I think we remain available to work with the government, with the public sector, with the private sector, to really realize this country's ambitions through energy and infrastructure development. Yeah. And it would be good to really work with the country. I mean, they've got their nationally determined contributions, around $68 billion. A lot of that which is explained to be externally funded. We are here to facilitate that, but it's going to take transparency, clarity on policy, as well as adherence to the rule of law.
Thank you. Yes, Ross.
Yeah. My parting shot is the public interest, the invigorous, what we're seeing in the public arena is good because it's going to keep government accountable. It's also helping us all as Kenyans to get better educated, more exposed to these PPPs. But I say, let us support executive. We need the infrastructure, and PPPs can unlock this for us as a country. So as we interrogate, let us not frustrate the process. Let's not just rush to court and stop processes for the sake of it, because we are hurting ourselves in the long run. We need the infrastructure to be developed to open up the economies. The infrastructure development is going to put money back in people's pockets, because sectors of the economy that are lagging now are going to become vibrant again. People will start trading again, like we saw in the Kibaki era when there was money circulating. So let us educate ourselves. Let's build capacity. Let's build the awareness and know-how of how these PPPs work. Let us support infrastructure development.
All right, and also important to note that frustration of the same process, the law, as put by the procedures, is equally important that it's adhered to and things done in a transparent manner at the expense of the people we talked about, the taxpayers. Yes. Your time is all appreciated. Mr. Paras Shah is the managing partner at Bowman's Kenya. Thanks for your time, much appreciated.
Thank you.
We'll have you again here. Rose Kananu is infrastructure project specialist, also joined us this morning. Mpokolo Makara is the head of energy and infrastructure at the Standard Bank Group. Ladies and a gentleman, your time is all appreciated. Many thanks for being with us here. And thanks to you too for waking up with us here on the broadcast. The hashtag has been Citizen Daybreak. The SMS code is 22422 at Citizen TV Kenya and at Ayub Abdikadir. Up next is Safin Acheng Oma on the Social Hour. And we'll see you tomorrow morning here at the same time. Till then, good morning.